Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valliant podcast. And today I'm joined by James Valliant and Professor Markus Vinzent, and we're going to be talking about the dating of Paul's letters. So, James and Markus, just real quick, thank you both for joining me today.
My pleasure. Always great to appear with Professor Vinzent.
Yep. And the first thing I want to start us off with is that it seems like lately there's been more people and at least some scholars opening up to the idea that Paul's letters have been misdated or something's wrong with the dating of the letters. How certain can one be that the epistles actually date to mid-1st century? Some people say, well, look at the Acts. Doesn't Acts clearly state that Paul's activities were in the 40s, 50s, and 60s? But Acts, strangely, does not mention Paul's letters either. And there have been different takes on that. But my first thing I'd like to ask you first, Markus, is when you looked at Paul's letters yourself early on, what occurred to you that made you realize something's wrong with the standard view of Paul's letters?
I have to say that there was something wrong occurred to me rather late in my life. Because I was brought up, as probably most of you were brought up, in school and in teaching and even at university level, that, we have 7 authentic letters, and then we have 3 disputed ones, which are not fully Pauline. I mean, they're still Pauline, but they were reckoned to have derived from a school of Paul. So these are called the second rate or second tier of Pauline letters. In Greek, deutero, which means second, deutero Pauline. So they're not really first-handed Pauline, but second-handed. And then we have a third category, which usually are being called pseudo-Pauline. So they're not by Paul at all, and neither are they by a Pauline school, but rather they are separate, and we are calling them the pastoral letters. So it's 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus. So that's more or less how I was brought up. And having just been in Leuven last week on the Colloquium Biblicum Lovaniense, so it's an annual meeting of Pauline scholars this time that debated 1 and 2 Corinthians. I guess I was the only one who was sitting on the margins and no longer believing in what I was told and what they all believed. I mean, without any exception except me, what they believe is exactly what I was just telling you. I mean, the 7, the 3, and the other 3 or 4 when you take into account also Hebrews. So that's the baseline I was brought up. But you asked what made me reflect on the Pauline letters. Actually, I started, even when I started working on Marcion about 15, 16 years ago, I still started on that assumption. The only doubt which quite soon came to me was that, as other people have before me have noticed, that Luke is rather a reworking of Marcion's gospel. Whoever was the author of this gospel, right? Park that for a moment. But people started to believe that Luke is a revised version of Marcion's and a broadening of Marcion's gospel. It dawned on me that also we might need to look into the relation between the 10-letter collection in Marcion's New Testament, whoever brought them together, and the 14-letter collection that we know. And as we can see that the 7 letters, which are until today, at least last week, being seen as the authentic letters, whether these 7 letters have indeed been shortened, or, like Luke, that these 7 letters consist in a revised and in a broadened collection of individual letters that are bigger and longer than the same 7 plus 3 letters are in Marston's collection. So the doubt came the moment when I realized that indeed Luke is a broadening, and maybe we have to extend that idea also. At least we have to question that, whether that same relation happens to the Pauline letters in a comparison between the 10 letters in Marston's collection and the 10 letters in the 14-letter collection that we have. So that was a question. And working on this, I also parked that for a while because I was writing a big book on how to write early Christian history, which I published in 2019. And the biggest bulk in this book of 2019 was research which I did on Ignatius. And to be fair, when I started working on Ignatius, I did not intend, or I did not even know what I was stumbling upon, because in doing my history of research in a way of a retrospective way, so in going backwards from today into the history of research, I came across William Cureton, who in the 19th century published from Syriac manuscripts 3 letters of Ignatius and a collection of 3 letters, not of 7 letters as we knew them. And as with Irenaeus, as with the Pauline letters until today, people quickly, or relatively soon, claimed that the 3 letters of Ignatius are a shortening of a 7-letter collection. Because we also have not only less letters, namely 3, but also the 3 letters are shorter than in Ignatius's 7-letter collection. So, having done my research on that, it was absolutely clear that the 3 letters were not shortenings of the 7-letter collection, but that the 7-letter collection was a broadening in 2 terms, namely in the number of letters, but also in growing the 3 letters that existed previously. So I had a parallel case to Paul, and then I started working on Paul again in light of the discoveries I made on Ignatius. And the result of that was published first in an attempt in my book on resetting the origins of early Christianity of 22, if I remember rightly. And just last week or last 2 weeks, I published the German book on by the title From Paul to Saul, and not the other way around. So how people have made out of Paul and the Pauline letters a Saul form of a history of Paul in Acts, for example. So this was my journey, and over the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, I've mainly spent my research time on Paul and on the letter collection of Paul. And at the end of this month, the Greek reconstruction of the 10 letters of Paul, the first Greek reconstruction of these 10 letters in the collection of Marcion, is going to be published with Na Franke in Tübingen. And hopefully, I think next year or at the latest the year after, depending on how much time I've got, I will also provide English translations of the book, which I published a few weeks ago, and also an English translation of the introduction and the critical edition, which I think, which I'm sure will be published with Peters and Leuven. So the same publisher that has published Klinghardt's reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel.
Awesome. When I first had you on 3 years ago, we talked about. I asked you about names in Paul, and I finally am. I'm putting together a document that I definitely would like to get your opinion on at some point if you'd want to see it, because and I was contacted by another scholar, because I did 2 shows with Derek on this issue not too long ago. And there's a strange story, and I know that scholars can be a bit too skeptical about church fathers, but as all 3 of us here know, the church fathers can provide and relay very strange information that can be valuable. And I would like to get your thoughts on a couple of things. We all know that Irenaeus story about John fleeing the bathhouse when Corinthus came in. It's kind of funny, but it's a strange story because Epiphanius also mentions that that Corinthus was causing trouble for Paul in Jerusalem. So the whole Galatian ordeal, according to Epiphanius, Corinthus was involved in it. But it's a strange thing to say, because if Paul is, the standard chronology of Paul is correct, what's giving church fathers like Epiphanius the impression that Paul is having arguments? Or even if one doesn't fully trust what Epiphanius is relaying, what's even giving him the idea that Paul is having arguments much later in the first century than the mid-first century? Because to believe that Paul and Corinthus had a confrontation at all, it's mind-boggling. It throws off the standard view on Paul. It would have to. And then you have the Acts of Timothy. Even if one doesn't trust the reliability of the Acts of Timothy, it thinks Timothy died at the end of Domitian's reign. So my question to you is, when you look at documents like these, including what Jerome says about Saul of Giscala, who he thinks was writing after the fall of Jerusalem, after the Jews have been expelled, he says, around the world, have been dispersed. Do you see this as evidence that the church fathers are confused about the chronology of Paul, that something is wrong?
Well, I think there's an easy answer to that. From the late 2nd century onwards, people are pretty much confused about almost any type of chronology of the 1st century. They don't seem to know a fair amount. You can see that in the confusion that exists even in people like Hegesippus. Hegesippus, for the readers who haven't come across Hegesippus, Hegesippus is our first so-called church historian. So he writes in around the years 180, so he's a contemporary of Irenaeus. And unfortunately, we only have a few fragments of his narrations, if it's a history at all. And they're all preserved, as always, preserved only in Eusebius. So that's one of the problems. But what I want to make the case is he knows and writes about early Christians in Jerusalem. He knows about James, the brother of the Lord. And he also writes about Rome. And now he totally confuses, apparently, the history of Rome. Yeah. So even to the extent, apparently, that Eusebius, when he locates and dates Hegesippus in his church history in the book 2, he thinks that he was alive in the beginnings of the 2nd century, so that he had a close knowledge about Rome of the 1st century to make him a good witness. And then later on in his church history, he explains that Hegesippus writes around or in the bishopric of Eleutherius, which is contemporary, as I said before, of Irenaeus. If that were true, I mean, he would have lived 120 years or 150 years, in writing this history. So this is just one example. People even our best historians like Hegesippus seem not to have transmitted to Eusebius any kind of reliable information, when he has lived and written, let alone what the history of the Roman Church was. Now, this is a pitiable situation in which we are in, that we have very, very little knowledge about the first century in historical terms. Then comes the big problem. Josephus, who is a problematic witness anyway for anything which he says about Christians, as we know. However, about Paul, he has no knowledge whatsoever. At least he doesn't say anything. So this is a big question for people even who would love to credit Paul with a solid personal historical biography in the first century. But if Josephus has any knowledge about Christians, and if that's not all interpolated by Christians, who are the only ones who transmit Josephus through history later on. So if he had such knowledge about Christians, why does he remain silent about Paul? This is inexplicable, I think. So again, we have no witnesses other than Christian witnesses which give us any knowledge about Paul. And yeah, Jacob, you can always interfere.
No, finish your thought, please.
So I think when it comes to the historical Paul, people agree we have Acts, and Acts is extremely doubtful, not only because Acts appears pretty late. The first mention of Act is, if I'm not mistaken, and I've worked on it in the last months, is Polycarp of Smyrna and Dionysius of Corinth and Irenaeus. Now, Dionysius of Corinth and Irenaeus are contemporaries. Polycarp is a bit earlier because Irenaeus says that when he was young, he was already sitting at the foot of Polycarp in his school and was taught by Polycarp. Now, when does he go to school in Polycarp? When he is a bishop in the 177 or 80, let's say 20 years earlier, so 167. And that would fit quite well because we are told that Polycarp lived until the reign of Mark Aurel. Now, Mark Aurel, that brings us before 168. Yeah. So that would fit well with Irenaeus' own description that he was a student of Polycarp. Now, if we are in the 160s with Polycarp, that means he cannot have suffered martyrdom in the 150s, as sometimes being claimed. Again, a confusion in Eusebius. So I think we are reliably more taught that we place Polycarp in the 160s. Now, this brings us to the time when people start giving us information about over 100 years earlier. And we don't have any earlier literature about the Pauline origin than that, or what we can find if we take away Acts, which is pretty late, so 160s. If we take a bit earlier, what we've got, the earliest collection of material, and that's why I'm so interested in Marcion, not because I'm a Marcionite, as sometimes people claim, but it is it's simply our early stratum of material, even if we don't have manuscript of him, but we have all the commentaries about what he had in his New Testament, and that's the early stratum at the moment. We can create and reconstruct and take information from. So the question then is, what do we find in that material about the historical Paul? And I'm not saying that we have the historical Paul, but what are we told in that material about a person who in this material is being constructed as historical Paul in the first century? I found it quite helpful last week in this colloquium in Leuven when Margaret Mitchell gave an interesting paper where she also criticized, but not rejected entirely, but also criticized Nina Livesey's new book on Paul, where Nina Livesey claims that all of Paul's letters are forgeries of the 2nd century. But we might discuss that a bit later. But Margaret Mitchell says, before we make any claim, we have to distinguish between different, let's say, historical Pauls. We have, she says, the assumed historical Paul as he lived in his body whenever we assume he lived. And she then accepts that this historical Paul we will never, ever be sure of or can never, ever attain. That's something which is simply, as for us as historical people and researchers, unattainable. A second Paul is the Paul who writes letters. So she says that's the letter writer Paul. But then, because we don't have his individual letters, not his autographs, not his letters at hand, we might only vaguely attain to this letter writing Paul. And then we have the third Paul with this, which is the Paul that is embedded in the letter collections. And we can discuss, and we will discuss today, how early are these letter collections? As I said, the letter collection that we can reconstruct is the earliest is that of Marcion. And that brings us to a letter collected Paul. And that's the one we can attain through a reconstruction, I admit, but at least something where we have witnesses telling us what in that collection was. And that's the Paul we can talk about. We might go one step back, and we'll come to it, because in that letter collection, I think we also have indications of an earlier letter collected Paul, or rather Pauls, so that we might have a window in the times before roughly 140 or 135. Yeah, that might be the case. So hopefully I haven't confused you, but you will see it is not just a straightforward task to cut through and to walk along hand in hand with nice Paul, have a chat. How are you and what do you think? And so we can take your letters, read what you told me, because you have told it to the Corinthians, the Romans, and I simply need to read 7 letters and I know what you mean.
When did Margaret Mitchell make that 3-tier Paul argument exactly?
Why she made it?
Yeah, when did she make it?
Oh, last week at the conference in Levine, which I just attended. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because that's almost literally the same stuff I said to Derek and to Robert Price, because I was, for completely different reasons though.
That's great.
I said there were 3 Pauls, and the reason I said that was because, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is if you look at the first Clement, whenever it was written, I go with the consensus dating on 1 Clement, but even in that form, I don't think it, from my point of view, I don't think it really knows canonical Paul, even in that form, because in those little parts of it that parallel canonical Paul, it also contradicts it. One brief instance is it says that Paul went furthest west of the empire, but in Romans 15, Paul says, I'm going to Hispania, but letters never state that he actually made it there. That's just one brief example so everybody understands what I'm talking about. So in 1 Clement, he has, as Oscar Coleman pointed out around I think in 1930 or around that other Christians killed Paul, or other believers killed Paul. Because Paul died due to jealousy and envy. That's how he interpreted 1 Clement, and I think that's a fair interpretation. Then you have the Acts of Paul, which is late 2nd century, which claims that Romans killed him. And then his head after he got beheaded, his head gets reattached to his neck somehow. And then you have Jerome, who talks about a post 70 AD Saul of Giscala, or Saul of Tarsus. So you have there, just from those texts, one can say 3 Pauls. And the confused chronology, although I'm saying it's for different reasons, reminded me of what you said about Margaret Mitchell. And if there's when you look at 1 Clement, it only cites a letter from Paul, a letter. He doesn't really indicate with any certainty many letters from the text that we have.
From the canonical Clement that we do have, he does seem to be citing a letter to the Corinthians explicitly, and a bit of Corinthians correspondence that seems to match. That is to say, when Paul is talking about the different schools, and never mind the of Paul, of Jesus, of Cephas schools, and that appears to be, and he, in our canonical version of First Clement at least, whatever might have been done to that letter of First Clement, he does seem to be citing something that we can recognize and explicitly saying it's a letter to the Corinthians. But you're absolutely right. What's interesting are the differences. He doesn't seem to be reliant on the letter to the Romans because Paul has already made it to Spain or the farthest west. And furthermore, he has 7 arrests, which seems to contradict Paul's little autobiography in 2 Corinthians. So the differences are interesting, but he does seem to be citing a bit of the Corinthians correspondence that we can recognize, and explicitly so, at least from what we have of First Clement.
I mean, that you would reckon with if let's say if it's a historical letter to the Corinthians, then you would expect it anyway. If it's a fictional letter, you would also expect that somebody who writes a fictional letter to the Corinthians and knows about First Corinthians, he would make some borrowings, right, to make it sound historical. I think both ways. But I think you're right. I mean, there are bits and pieces which I also recognize, and anybody else would also recognize in that letter. Maybe, Jacob, I come back to one question which I left open, and that's the Cerinthus episode, right? Now, Epiphanius, of course, brings us into the 4th century.
Yes.
And from the way Epiphanius amalgamates knowledge that he somehow crabs together in his panarion, in his chest box, right, of medical stuff. He is probably the heresiologist who knew least of the historical stuff of the 3rd century, let alone of the 2nd and the 1st century. I think and why he produced this type of a debate between Paul and Cerinthus is because already the Cerinthus business starts with Irenaeus, as you rightly pointed out. And here we have this other confusion in Irenaeus, that he makes the claim that his teacher went to the bath. Yeah. So you see the parallelism. And his teacher who went to the bath, right, discovered that Cerinthus is there, and horrified as he is, he leaves the bath because he doesn't want to encounter Cerinthus and have a discussion with him. Whether that ever happened, we don't know. Because on Cerinthus, as Gerhard May once wrote an article on Cerinthus, we know nothing except what we just talked about. And this is the surprise. I mean, if he had if he were in any way let's say a teacher of Marcion or a teacher of other people, we would have known something. I mean, we don't know much about the 2nd century, but we know quite well the genealogies of teachings. And if you compare what people are saying about Cerinthus and what we know about Marcion and other people, there's little connection. It rather seems that because in the 2nd century, Irenaeus particularly wants to create these genealogies of heresies, like Tertullian later on. So there is no good teacher who is a heretic, who hasn't got a father who is even more heretical as the student. So heretics, as Tertullian says, they create and mate and create students who are then also heretics. So that you need to have schools. I think the reality behind that is that in the 2nd century, indeed, most of the teachers that we are talking about, and they're all teachers, whether it's Polycarp, whether it's Valentinus, whether it is Marcion, the people we know, Basilides, they all have teaching houses, didaskalaion, or didaskaleia. Justin, in his martyrdom, we know teaches, and he himself says teaches. So these are teachers. And apparently they also have successors. But because in the 2nd century they are not yet heretics, we don't hear about their fathers. They are individuals. And when you take Clement of Alexandria, who probably is, as himself being a teacher, is closer to history and to the truth, you don't hear about Cerinthus being the teacher of Marcion. But you hear that he says, when these people, after the Second Jewish War, so after 135, were dispersed because of the political turmoil and made their ways out of Jerusalem, out of Samaria, they started creating teaching places in Ephesus, like Justin, and in Rome, like Valentinus and Marcion. And then he says, the oldest amongst the whole bunch who left their homes and went into creating teaching rooms elsewhere in the secure land, the oldest of all of them was Marcion. So he doesn't seem to have Cerinthus as a father. I think that's a story by Irenaeus made up to create a parallel story to another story that he also relates, and that is about an encounter between Marcion and Polycarp. So Polycarp does not only flee Cerinthus, according to Irenaeus, but he also flees Marcion. Or rather, there was an encounter when Irenaeus tells us that when Marcion asked Polycarp, so he seems to have gone to Polycarp and wanted to talk to him. And he asks him, do you know me? Irenaeus tells us that Polycarp answers to Marcion, of course I know you. You're the son of a devil. So not the son of Cerinthus, yeah, but even worse, the son of a devil. And this story, maybe, whether historical or not, we can't judge that, right? But it shows that there is an idea still that these people met, or at least that it was an historical, fictional reality that people could have met and wanted to meet and had engaged with each other and had discussions. And that this is not an absurd idea. You can see from the school of Polycarp, of which we know a bit more because we have that report of Irenaeus as one of the students. First of all, Irenaeus tells us in a letter that he writes to a co-student, potentially a bit older than him, Florinus, he is called. And in this letter to Florinus, he criticizes Florinus for ideas which we would call Valentinian ideas. So apparently, in the school of Polycarp, we not only have Orthodox people like Irenaeus, but we also have Valentinians. So these schools are not as we have them in our heads today, and as Irenaeus wants us to believe in his book against the heresies, particularly against the Gnostics, the Valentinians, they are not separated yet in the 2nd century. At the feet of Polycarp, we have people sitting who have and are particularly thinking in Valentinian and in Gnostic terms. And that's not a surprise. Likewise, we have Polycarp quoting in his letter to the Philippians the 3 synoptic gospels. But people have always noticed, not just Kampenhausen and others, but people have noticed that he hardly makes use of John's gospel. What a surprise. No, because Irenaeus also tells us that John's gospel was first commented upon by a Valentinian, by Ptolemaeus. And that this Ptolemaeus had a different form of John's gospel where, for example, the incarnation was missing. So pretty interesting. And we can see that even when Ptolemaeus has this special reading of John's Gospel, yeah, he might not be in a separate school. Probably he was, but he could easily also have sat at the feet of Polycarp, because Irenaeus makes a big case that Polycarp is a student of John and that he knows everything from the apostles through John, not through Luke, not through Matthew, not through Mark. So you can see, no doubt, if we are confused, these people were confused even more than we are. So about history, what I'm trying to say all along these last years is, when we look into the 2nd century and into the times after the Second Jewish War, when we have the first creation of these Christian schools, these schools are not hermetically separated. They have their own views, they develop their views, but they are apparently a mixed bag of students and so forth. Irenaeus himself is a very good case. Why does he write his book again, or his books against the heresies? He tells us in the preface to his 3rd and his 4th books. And there he says that the anonymous person who asks, and probably also paid for, him writing these books, requested from him information about the teaching of the Valentinians. And then Irenaeus answers to this patron. He says, oh, you will have read the first 2 volumes, which I've sent to you. Here's the 3rd one. And be not surprised. I give you more than what you have asked me to do. Which is a bit of a strange thing. So he gives the patron not what the patron has paid for. Now, what has he paid for? We don't know. But what Irenaeus delivers, he then explains. And he says to his patron, if you read what I've now sent you, you will no longer take the people, and apparently he is a teacher himself, so you won't take these people any longer, he says, into the abyss of the sea and drown them there. Which tells us the patron of Irenaeus was himself most likely a Valentinian, because that's always the take that Irenaeus has, that these Valentinian teachers take the people into the abyss of the sea and drown them. Now, if he says, you have to read my books, and if you, which is not really the match of your expectations, but if you follow these books, then you will no longer take your people and drown them, but you will rescue them. And this is reflected already in the preface to the 1st book, where Irenaeus says, the people should discover when they read my book that these Valentinians are wolves in sheepskin. So you will not discover who they are. They look like us, they teach like us, they speak like us, they smell like us, they are sheep like us. And only when you read my books, you will discover inside these sheep, there's a different mindset. And you can see so closely related are these schools that people like Florinus are part of Polycarp's school. And even the patron of Irenaeus is somebody who, without reading Irenaeus' book, carries on and would carry on to drown the people, so to be a wolf in a sheepskin. So I hope, at least, you get a sense of the proximity of these various people and how they try to make sense of this novel idea of this teaching which arises with this New Testament that Martin had put together, and with Paul's letters that he has put together, and how they wrestle with these texts. 1 Clement is a fantastic example, also the link to Polycarp's school, because of all texts, 1 Clement is the text that has most parallels to Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. In total, 57 parallels. Next comes only the first epistle to Peter, who has about 38 parallels to Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. So First Clement is so closely related. When you look at the opening, the first section, the address, it is absolutely identical. First Clement and the epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians. Absolutely identical. 2.5 lines, same text. The only difference is where Polycarp says it's Polycarp who writes, in Clement it's Clement. Where Polycarp says Polycarp and my brothers who are with me, Clement simply says Clement. And then it is the addressees, they're different. Philippians and Rome and Corinth. That's the difference. The rest is absolutely identical. Now we have to make sense of that, right? And one of the ways I try to make sense of this kind of proximity of these two texts is they seem to be deriving from the same school, from the same background. Though from different authors maybe in the school, but being redacted in a way, because why would Polycarp, as a teacher, would simply steal and borrow and plagiarize First Clement, or the other way around? Why would would Clement plagiarize Polycarp? Again, this throws up the question of dating these texts. But you can read the text yourself and you will discover how parallel these two texts are. We can also take then First Peter, the next text that is so closely related to Polycarp's writing, to see how related these texts are. Now, if we then think of the close relation that Polycarp has with Marcion, Marcion has with Polycarp, that they reject each other, yes, okay, but they borrow from each other, yeah, that's where we get our information from. So I think we should not ask Epiphanius for better information. He must have been totally confused, as he was with many other things. But I think that's the potential historical background, that we have this kind of a debate between the various schools in the 2nd century. And then we may ask, what do they do with poor Paul, one of the three that Jacob has mentioned?
The next thing I'd like to ask about, and James, I would like you to chime in as well. When we did our in-person discussion at SBL, you had brought up a point that I believe you were citing Clement of Alexandria in this context about lack of historical evidence for 1st century bishops of Rome, that there was no evidence that there were bishops of Rome in the 1st century. And my second part to that question is, when you look at canonical Paul and you see names like Clement, Epaphroditus, and also Erastus, do any of these names show up in the Marcionite edition?
No, that's the other thing. First of all, we don't have even the mention of bishops. Even in the canonical Paul, we only have one instance in Philippians where he mentions bishops in the plural and deacons. But again, this is absent from the Marcionite collection. Now, Polycarp, we had just had it. Polycarp, in his letter to the Philippians, never speaks of bishops. He calls himself simply a presbyter. So let me even think whether I'm right in saying that he doesn't mention bishops. I need to check that again. But at least himself, he always, and whenever we have it in this letter, only knows of himself as a presbyter. Which is quite interesting, because when Irenaeus talks about Polycarp, he doesn't call him a bishop either. And yet, when we look into Irenaeus, we can still see and I correct myself, I think Polycarp talks about bishops, but he doesn't make the difference between bishops and presbyters, just as Irenaeus does. So these titles, when they come up in the 2nd century, and we are in the 160s, are still not separated. In Clement, we have the chapter 40 or 42, I think it's 42 if I remember rightly, where only once also bishops and deacons in the plural appear. And Clement says to his addressees, oh, you shouldn't think that these are novelties. And then he doesn't quote Paul Philippians. He quotes, if I remember rightly, Josiah or Jeremiah. And so he brings up a quote where the title episcopos appears. But of course, in the Old Testament, episcopos was not a Christian bishop. So it is the need, apparently, that something comes up as a new job title in the mid-2nd century, which is borrowed, as far as we know, from the secular environment. People sometimes have made a claim that it's related to the Qumran, to the Jewish job of a marhaba, of an overseer. But probably yes, probably no, I don't know. In Greek literature of the 1st, 2nd centuries, an episkopos is what we would call a building engineer, is the one who oversees building works, road works, the creation of houses, temples. So it's not a liturgical job. And apparently, these are types of jobs that crop up in the middle of the 2nd century and slowly make their way into a Christian community. For example, when Justin talks about deacons, he does it 4 times, if I remember right, or 3 times. Each time he says the so-called deacons. It's not yet something people know what he's talking about. So we have this kind of a slow growth, right? And we have then people like the Ignatian letters, which make a big claim about the one bishop in a community. But that's music for the future. That comes at the time of Irenaeus, but is not yet present in the majority of the writings that we have. So I think it's fair to say that Polycarp takes and understands himself as a presbyter, just as throughout these 60-odd chapters of First Clement is always talk about the presbyters and the debate about presbyters, except this one small passage where we have this one mention of deacons and bishops.
You want my comment on it, Jacob?
No, go ahead. Yeah,
I think that's. I think in a what we would call a Christian, a Greek Christian context, in the 1st century, it is extremely problematic to think of a leadership structure. And I think that the standard view that the pastorals, for example, in speaking of an elaborate organization and the need to organize, we've got to have bishops, on the island. Just on the island of Crete, we've got to organize bishops there. If the pastorals are talking in that sense, they're speaking of a later need to organize, it seems to me. On the other hand, as iffy as it is, if we project back into a more Jewish context for a Jesus, if we think there's an authentic 1st century Jesus movement, we have all kinds of traditions about Jesus passing off the torch to a new, whether it's James or Peter, or whether it's giving praise to John the Baptist. I think there are leaders, let me put it this way, within movements in the 1st century, even in what we might call for lack of a better term, an original Jesus movement or a Jewish Christian context. I think that it's hard to miss that there are statements about leadership, whether that leadership is being passed to James or whether that leadership is being passed to Peter. It is of vital importance to 2nd century writers who that leader was and who got the torch passed to them. And one of the interesting things about First Clement is that it does seem to be concerned about authority. We have obviously references at the end of Romans that are interesting, but not quite there yet to what the pastorals are talking about. But most interestingly, it is Philippians, it would seem to me, when it comes to early Christian leadership. And I find very appealing Professor Vinzent's idea that these different schools are still sort of nebulous and still in communication with each other. But as time goes on, those dividing lines between the different kinds of Christianity, the different Christianities, which I think might be a better way of describing the second century, are sort of forming in the same stellar nebula, like the astronomers say stars come from. They're forming in the same stellar nebula, but soon striking off in different directions where they're saying, oh, well, you're worse than the devil. And, there's nothing like an apostate, who you perceive as an apostate, to be the worse enemy than, say, maybe even a pagan might be they're the devil themselves, because they vary from me. And by the time you get to Irenaeus, obviously, and Tertullian, that's becoming a real issue. But I think in an earlier phase, I think it's very tempting to go with Professor Vinzent here. They're coming from the same nebulosity about considerations of Christianity. And when we think of Pauline Christianity, something like what we think of as New Testament Christianity having leadership roles in the first century, I think that's extremely problematic. On the other hand, there does seem to be a tradition that makes it very important for early Christians to say, well, who got the leadership role? Who did Jesus pass the torch to? Was it James? Was it Peter? Because that has enormous significance when the divisions do become important, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes sense. And I think you made a very important observation about jobs and job titles. Let's take the Pauline letters. Even if we take the canonical Paul as we have it, we have, just like in Clement, only, as I said, and you repeated that as well, just in Philippians, this one mention of bishops and deacons. But it is interesting to ask the question, what other job and offices are represented in Paul's letters? And let's take these canonical letters, so let's go into Marcionites texts. If the Christian movement had been a historical movement from the first century, it would have been embedded in the Jewish community, as we all say. But then we have to ask ourselves, why? If that were the case, why, and if Paul's letters were somehow related to that first century, why on earth it is possible that not a single synagogal job, not a presbyter or any heroes or whatever it is, appears in Paul's letters? In Paul, we don't find presbyters. Never. Even not in the canonical Paul. When he talks about the people who are fronting the community, he calls them prohistomenoi, people who stand before us, which is no job title except for saying, well, James and Jacob are sitting in front of us. Yeah. Then we have the description that these people are copying or copian. So they are hard working, but that's not a job title. We have no job titles.
What do you make
of,
sorry to interrupt, but what do you make of the Galatians discussion? These pillars, these somebodies,
pillars,
and they appear to have a leadership. I mean, people from James buy out my freedom in Christ.
I'm not saying we don't have leadership, but these leaders have titles like pillars. Yeah, pillars or people who stand in front of you, who don't fall over. Yeah, but those are no job titles that we find in any synagogue. And that's the interesting thing. So if you want, and if we then look also into Marcion's Paul, same thing, right? Even the bishops and the deacons have gone. So there is no job title that relates these communities to anything, in this sense at least, to anything to do with the synagogue. Neither to do with Roman cult personnel. There are no priests and no sacrificers and God knows what. Yeah. The closest you get probably is then Romans 15, which is missing in Marcion, where there's a kind of liturgical priestly job, but even there's no title left. So we are with Paul. You are probably as well as in Mitreum, which creates its own job titles. So it's a novelty. This cult form is a novelty which is as unusual for a Jewish community as it would be for a pagan community. And that's why we don't have parallels, which makes the job even more difficult to question and to ask and answer the question, to what extent are these letters reflecting a communal life, or either pagan Rome or Jewish or both, because in a way, at least regarding the job titles, they don't.
Well, in the post-temple destruction world, we're still given Jewish leadership titles, even though there's no temple around.
Of course, we have Kohanims.
Yeah.
Until today.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have the interesting citation from Eusebius, where he says that Hadrian permitted the appointment of Christian bishops, which is a curious thing, which would still...
after destruction, after the Jewish war.
Exactly, it would only put it in the one...
But that he says, which means the Christians then, for the first time, appointed an uncircumcised bishop. But then, for Eusebius, all leaders in the second and in the first century are bishops. Because for him, it's clear. I mean, who else in the 4th century could lead a Christian community except a bishop? But coming back to the lists of bishops in Rome, he, for example, deviates from Irenaeus, because Irenaeus, as I said, creates these genealogies of heretics and heretical schools. So he also creates a list of bishops in Rome. And he says, after Peter, who of course is then also a bishop, after Peter, straight Clement was appointed, the successor of Peter. Now, this is an embarrassment for Eusebius, because he wants the first epistle of Clement, of which we have talked before, to be written by Clement, who we know, or who he knows from the list of bishops of Irenaeus. But he was at least that type of historian to understand that a bishop who was the successor of Peter could hardly have written a letter that Eusebius, dates into the times of about 90 or 100. Yeah, so, I mean, grandfathers can write, but grandfathers have difficulties in writing, at least from the graves, right? So what does he do? He says, Clement wasn't the successor of Peter. There was one in between.
Connective tissue.
And you can see, I mean, this is total confusion.
Right? He knows Clement is written much later.
Yeah, and I tell you, I've just reviewed this type of reconstructing Clement's dating on reliance on Eusebius, done by Tassilo Schmidt in 2002. I think it's a disaster. It's simply impossible. I mean, to take Eusebius as even more reliant than Irenaeus, whereas I think Irenaeus is mistaken, Eusebius is twice mistaken, right? Yeah, I mean, these people create bishops where no bishops existed yet. They created potentially bishops for a community that might have existed, but certainly not in the reconstruction of 100 years later or 200 years later. So we have to be cautious when we do history in this sense.
I'd like to take a couple of super chats real quick. We'll start with Solar Knight. Thank you for your super chat. 1 John 2:18, Antichrist, God-man, is coming. Even now many Antichrists have come. Deified Romans. John warning false apostles like Paul, teaching from visions of Docetism. Any comments on this?
Yeah, of course. This is a trope, of course. You have it also in our letter in Ephesians, who says that before the end comes, you have the Antichrist, the man who sits itself into the temple and claims to be God. So all of that. For Marcion, in his parallel letter in the Laodiceans, it is clear that this is the Jewish God. This is the demiurge who disguises itself as the one who creates this world and also seems to be the same to rescue this world. Marcion takes that apart and takes them as two. The canonical text, of course, makes the devil out of it and says, oh no, the Antichrist is the one who really misleads everybody. Now, who the Antichrist, and even the plural of Antichrists, so it couldn't be Paul, maybe it's the second or third Paul, or it's a Pauline school, I don't know.
Paul.
Yeah. I mean, the plural of Antichrists, of course, makes it even harder. I think Antichrist becomes a label of a heretic. I mean, heretical labels are like broad heads, sombreros, under which you can fit a number of heads. It's one size. It fits every head. And even if you have 10 heads underneath them, they're all Antichrists. As a label, I think that's how I would explain it. It's interesting that this is in a letter by John, because I think that's where your question leads us to. The Johannine people, as we still can see in Polycarp, have their own take. Polycarp has indeed two parallels to the first, second, and then even a parallel to the third letter of John. So he knows these letters. He doesn't reject them. He even has one small potential parallel to John's Gospel. So he does not reject the Johannine tradition. And maybe that's why why Irenaeus claims him to be a student of John, if he is the student of this John, because who the Johns are is as difficult as who the people leading the church in Rome are. But what I'm just saying is there are relations. How close they are, we don't know. And that the Johannine people then are critical of the, let's say, other people like Polycarp and like Marcion. That is apparent. On the other side, they make use of similar texts. The Johannine people have their own texts. John's Gospel is developed. John's letters are parallel and so close to John's Gospel in many ways that people have claimed there is a Johannine school. Probably yes. But students of that school, certainly, as we have seen, have attended other schools too. And this is the nature. I mean, if you take the fantastic story that Justin gives us in his autobiographical entry to his dialogue with Tryphon, where he says, oh, I traveled the world, So I first was a student of this school, then of this school, then of this school. Some charged money, then I moved on. And at the end, he's sitting in front of a Jew. And it appears it is a Jew who leads him into Christianity. Very similar is Josephus' account in his autobiography, where he says, oh, I traveled all the different schools of Jews and ended up with the Pharisees. And even Plotinus, in the biography on Plotinus, so this is the philosopher of the 3rd century, Porphyry says that in Plotinus' school, he had a range of other people. And the most interesting students of his, where he talked to and engaged with, were Gnostic students. And that's why there is one tract of Plotinus to the Gnostics. So it seems to be a feature of at least of 2nd and 3rd century schools of those intellectuals, that they moved schools while being students. Like students today. I mean, my students who come to me to do an MA with me haven't done the undergraduates with me. And if they go to a PhD, they go to a colleague. So this is apparently just how it is in scholarship over 2,000 years and probably even longer.
Of course, even St. Augustine tells us about the various schools that, he went through, the phases he went through in his own development.
Exactly.
That included Plotinus at one point, but then he found Christianity in the truth.
Yeah, at least in the Manichaean tradition, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he moves to Ambrose, he moves to other people. So it's people being on the move and taking in, making their own take and giving their own take and trying to model what they have. And of course, for us who try to structure this development, that makes the job a bit more difficult.
Kathy Brocato, thank you for your super chat. Kathy says, thank you for a wonderful episode. Well, thank you, Kathy. Appreciate it.
Much appreciated.
Now, for this super chat, I'm going to pull up 1 Clement, but I'll read this first. Michael E., thank you for your super chat. To clarify, 1 Clement 47 explicitly mentions Paul's letter to Corinthians. Why does this not provide external evidence for dating Paul's letter? Since that's one of my favorite verses in 1 Clement, how about we go take a look at that ourselves and see exactly how 1 Clement actually talks about it. Let me just find it on my computer real quick. There we go. I'm going to go right to where it is.
Jacob just happens to have handy his text of 1 Clement.
Well, because this is a point that I make to people often, because I do go with the standard dating of 1 Clement, even if one goes to the standard dating of 1 Clement, it doesn't actually prove that all of canonical Paul is pre-70 AD.
Well, look, it first starts Analabete ten epistolaen tu Macariu Paulo tu Apostolo. So pick up the epistle of the blessed Paul,
Exactly.
the epistle, yeah?
It's not even referring to Clement. It's not even referring to I'm sorry if I interrupted you. It's not even referring to the letter entirely by title. But go ahead.
No, first of all, but look, the biggest problem is not that one could take 1 Clement 47 as a term which would give us a dating of Paul's letter, simply because we cannot date 1 Clement.
See,
it's always the circularity, you see. We don't know the date of 1 Clement. We don't know what the term of reference is. That's the biggest problem.
Yeah, first we have to date 1 Clement and know that it wasn't altered.
Yeah. See, they translated pretty similar to what I've just translated it.
Yeah, precisely. Take up the epistle to bless Paul the Apostle. This is the only time, and when you look at the Greek, it's singular, it's not plural, and Clement never refers to Paul's letters in plural anywhere.
No, ten epistolaen, it says, It says the letter. So which letter it is? People, because he's writing to the Corinthians, people have assumed it's the letter to the Corinthians. It could be, but must not be. The next sentence is even more interesting. What wrote he first unto you in the beginning of the gospel? Has he written a gospel? Which gospel is 1 Clement referring to?
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. And it's the beginning. So,
this is the point I'm making. I mean, and while we can have different points of view about when Clement is written, the point that I'm making, that I think all of us here will agree, is Clement's not even saying what people are trying to say it says anyway. It's not really helping their case. And that's kind of my point that I'm trying to make.
No, you're absolutely right. But
It's
as I said before, the bigger problem with 1 Clement is that I think dating it as Eusebius again suggests to us, and that's why he muddles around with the Irenaean lists of Roman bishops, is to have a case to link this Clement to the Clement of Rome, to the bishop. The second problem is, of course, that the name of Clement is, the Clements, there were many Clements at the time, who this Clement is, we don't know. But the biggest thing is, if you look into Clement 1:1, and you see that this is an absolute parallel, as I said before, an absolute parallel to Polycarp's Philippians. It's literally the same. That we need to discuss, and that we need to explain.
The question still remains: who's influencing whom?
because one could argue, which is kind of what I think right now, that Philippians was borrowing from Clement. That's just that's just me.
Wouldn't that be fascinating?
But then you need to think, why would a teacher like Polycarp borrow 57 times First Clement? So it's like a synoptic text. It's a bit like our synoptic gospels. There are literal parallels.
The number of overlaps that you cite there is
incredible.
Absolutely fascinating, Professor. Because
it's incredible.
Yeah. How do we know that there's a relationship? Now we can argue about the relationship, but it's undeniable that there's a close relationship between the two.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now you think of a letter written in, supposedly written in Rome, written to the Corinthians. That's in Greece, Rome. Now we cover almost the entire Mediterranean area, because with Polycarp we are in Smyrna or in Ephesus. Now he gets hold of a letter in, where does he get hold of it? And then he copies it. As a teacher, you copy just. Good. Well, I mean, we can make all claims, but
I wish we had more and better sources. But before the middle of the 2nd century, we really have a dearth of reliable information.
Precisely.
That's
really take this text and then to hang a dating of many other texts, like Paul's letters, on a text which we apparently can't date at the moment, at least. To me, the best explanation I would have, because Polycarp is not only having and showing these enormous amount of parallels to 1 Clement, but also to 1 Peter, to a number of other texts. I mean, to the Synoptic Gospels, for example, and so forth. I think he has, and maybe one more observation which supports the case. Polycarp hardly borrows or has parallels, if you like, has parallels to the Marcionite version of texts. So he mostly disregards the texts that Marcion has produced. Whenever Polycarp quotes Paul's letters, or has parallels, let's put it that way, it is the Pseudo-Paulines and those texts and verses from the Deutero-Paulines which are missing in Marcion's texts. I'll give you the example. We just had this one explicit reference, Polycarp has 4 explicit references where he says, "A dotes hoti." You should know that. And then come a text. The first of those texts comes from the canonical letter to the Ephesians. That's his first explicit quote in his letter to the Philippians. The second explicit quote where he says, "A dotes hoti," you can, or you know that, is 1 Timothy. So Pseudo-Pauline letter. The third is Galatians. And it is a verse which is identical also in Marcion's collection. And that is why I think Polycarp mixes this verse with a verse from 1 Thessalonians. And this verse of 1 Thessalonians does not feature in Marcion. So the entire quote becomes a non-Marcionite quote from Paul. And the same with Romans. It's the fourth quote, 8 doti hoti, you know that, where he quotes from Romans chapter 8 and Romans chapter 3, a mixed combination of text again, both verses missing in Marcion's text. What I'm just saying is, Polycarp, in his letter to the Philippians, makes a big statement for the novel collection of non-Marcionite Paul. A Paul that is embracing the new forms of the Deuteropaulines as they are being redacted, I think, in Polycarp's school. He suggests a quote from Paul, which is pseudo-Paul, namely pastoral letters, because as von Kampenhausen already said, these letters seem to also to have been written in Polycarp's school. Maybe not as he thought by Polycarp himself, but I think they derive as school products from the school of Polycarp. And that explains first the quote, but also the many parallels that we can find in Polycarp's Philippians to the pastoral letters. And if that's the case, if that's the profile of Polycarp, then I think it makes a lot of sense that one Clement should be part and should have been part of that same school environment, and that it's been produced in the same way. And that's why we have these literal identical openings of these letters, which to me says, me as a teacher, you can also rely on one Clement, because that comes from the same mind, not from the same pen maybe, because we claim it to be by Clement, but it is the same mindset as we teach here in the school.
Solar Knight, thank you for your super chat. In a galaxy far, far away is Earth. What date?
Well, look, the answer to that is as precise as the bishops in Rome.
James Haro, thank you for becoming a member of the channel. Appreciate it. James, you're about to say something?
No, I think that what we have to do when it comes to the dating of Paul's letters is ignore, first of all, I think that we have to recognize that Acts, this connects to the question before the earlier one about Clement being attestation to Paul. It's certainly, on the face of it, not an attestation to the canonical Paul that we have. I mean, you have to recognize that right up front. But I think it's very easy, and this is what sucked me in. You asked Professor Vinzent about his biography on the subject. Of course, I came in the door assuming that the authentic letters of Paul, and we can argue over what's pseudo and stuff, but the authentic letters of Paul were written in the middle of the first century. I mean, after all, doesn't Acts depict Paul on trial before Governor Felix? And that would, place that event around 60 or so CE. And when we connect Galatians, let's assume that Josephus is telling us about James, the brother of Jesus, being executed in 62. Then we connect it to Galatians. Well, gosh, this seems to be the same James, the brother of Jesus. Suddenly we have a whole mountain of evidence. And then if in his correspondence with the Corinthians, Paul says, I fled from Aretas, and that would place it seemingly in the late 30s, you can see why they make the argument. You can see why they make the standard argument about the dating of the mid-first century. There is some evidence. Once we reject the historical reality of Acts, and in fact are willing to entertain the idea that we are being misled as to when the letter writer, I mean, there's no letters being mentioned in Acts, but we are obviously being given a biography of Paul. Once we question the accuracy of that biography and we say, aha, we're being misled, specifically being misled as to the biography of the person who wrote those letters, then I think the house of cards comes tumbling down. I think we have to focus on, as Professor Vinzent does, we have to focus on internal evidence within Paul's letters. And once I started looking in that way, I began to recognize that this makes much more sense in a post-temple environment. When in Corinthians he says, we Christians are the temple. In fact, the material temple is a bad thing because it's subject to the flames. We don't need no stinking material temple. Suggestions like that tell me
The wrath of God against the Jews in First
that
Thessalonians.
Thessalonians telling the wrath of God has come to the to the Jews, to the Thessalonians. Evidence of that sort began to orient me in a post-war context for so much of the substance of what we find in the Pauline material that we have to just throw that out. You add in, for example, when Jerome, for example, says, gives his description, Jerome combines confusing things. He says, yes, Paul was martyred under Nero, but then he seems to suggest that Paul was a young man when the land was laid waste and the people were dispersed. It was only after that he became a student. That would place Paul as a young man around 70. So what we have is all kinds of confusion, enormous confusion. If Jerome is translating this guy and he's saying, well, no, I have a source, Epaphras, who it seems to be a Jerome source that tells me that Paul was a young man. Paul of Giscala was a young man at the time of the destruction of the temple. Then it can't be the same guy who fled from Aretas or who was martyred under Nero. What it does tell me is that our early church fathers really have a bunch of confused and contradictory information about Paul's biography. I'm not going to trust the book of Acts anymore, that this is the letter writing Paul who stood trial before Governor Felix. I'm just going to throw that out the window. And then I'm going to look to internal evidence within Paul's letters to be a better guide. And so much of it seems to direct me into a post-war environment anyway, that I think we have to chuck, this is me speaking here, I think we have to chuck the standard dating of the letter writer Paul as being mid-first century. That is no longer tenable to me. If you just want my own thoughts on it. I'm certainly not the linguist Professor Vinzent is. I'm always fascinated to listen to what he says. But I think, ladies and gentlemen, the old-fashioned Orthodox view of relying on the Book of Acts and grounding Paul, the letter writer, in mid-first century is a myth, and we have to get past that. Christians are confused about who Paul is, what his biography is, and the internal evidence from Paul's letters actually suggests that they were written, to me, that they were written in a post-war environment. I find it hard, for example, that the circumcision or eating with Gentiles debate that we read about in Galatians could plausibly be before the war. And so I really think if you're going to have it, even as heated as the argument seems to be in Galatians, in our canonical Galatians, it doesn't strike me as making much sense in a Jewish community as intense as the Jewish and as orthodox as the Jewish community would have been before the first war. So I think we have to just reorient ourselves to a later understanding of when these letters came into being, however they came into being. I think it's far more circumstantially plausible that they were written at least after the First War. And that's new to me. As I began my studies with these things, I accepted the standard view that our quote, authentic letters were mid-first century. I don't think that's tenable. I simply don't think that's tenable.
Well, I think, James, you're in good company, even with the majority of scholarship with regards to the skepticism about the historicity of what's being reported in Acts. If you look at the more recent biographies of Paul, there are either extremely cautious when using Acts for reconstructing Paul's life. I think the majority would dispense of using Acts whatsoever, and take Sanders, take other people. I mean, they try to rely on Paul alone. And just in the colloquium I was talking about at the beginning of our session, people abstain from using Acts or from using even the Deuteropaulines, let alone the Pseudo-Paulines. So they concentrate on the 7 letters and try to extract from what these letters tell us. The problem I see with that is, and here I would partly side with you, in one sense I would disagree with you, but I'll mention that in afterwards. I side with you in one sense that when I compare the 10-letter collection of the Marcionite New Testament with the 14 letters of the canonical texts, it is not just that we skip now the pseudo-Paulines, as the scholars last week did, or that we can skip the Deutero-Paulines. But the additional texts which the canonical 7 letters have are so closely related in language, in style, but also in content, to precisely those texts which we have just discarded. Prisca and Avila, the whole story you will only find again in pseudo-Pauline texts, so in the pastoral letters, and in Acts. And a number of other people who you will find, for example, in 1 Corinthians 16, in Philippians 4, in Colossians 4, you will always find in Acts. Even when it comes to Timothy. And this is very simple. Timothy never appears in the Marcionite 10 letters. But how does he come to be a co-author and a co-worker of Paul in so many letters, 2 Corinthians and God knows what? How does that come? Well, if you forge letters, and people speak of forgery, of pseudo-Pauline letters, if you forge those letters, of course you would forge maybe one to Titus, because he's the only co-worker in the Marcionite collection. But you would forge 2 letters to a Timothy. But then you need to place Timothy central into the 7 authentic, so-called authentic letters of Paul. And that's what happens. So you have to make those links so that people are not just deceived. No, people have the impression, reading the pastoral letters, that's intrinsically reading Paul. And a number of things we wouldn't have known about Paul if we only have the pastoral, or if we only have 7 letters.
So you're suggesting that Timothy being cited as a co-author is itself a development from the need to authenticate Timothy,
Absolutely.
this alleged correspondent in the pastorals with Paul.
Yeah, exactly. Timothy only makes its way into history once the pastoral letters appear, and then he needs to be present in the 7 letters. Hence, Acts is a reductional product which supports the canonical form of the Pauline letters, just as the canonical form, and I include now all the 14 letters, support Acts. That's the close relation.
What would you say? What would you say if someone said, by naming him, they could have named him within the letter, but by naming him as a co-author, they're diluting the authority of Paul? Don't
exactly. I mean, that's one of the purposes, because if you take Acts, it's also a diluting of authority. It's the same strategy. In Acts, we are told that Paul is not even an apostle. That's how Acts starts. Acts says an apostle is who has been with Jesus from his appearance to his ascension. Paul never was. The only time that Paul is called an apostle in Acts is in chapter 14, if I remember rightly, where he is sent by the community in Antioch, apostolos. He is somebody who is sent by a community, not by the 12 and not by the divine Lord. Never. He is not an apostle. And the same is in the reductional canonical 7 letters. There in 1 Corinthians 15, exactly in the verses 3 following that are missing in Marcion's Paul and Marcion's 1 Corinthians. There we learn that Paul is the least who shouldn't even be named an apostle, because he's the last of all. So you see, it's the same strategy. It's diluting his authority by bringing in other people who write with him, like Galatians, the brothers. By the way, exactly a parallel to Polycarp, where he says, me and the brothers who are with me. are writing. Yeah, so it's the same idea, same style. And that's why he then gets Sosthenes and he gets Timothy. But Timothy is more important than Sosthenes, because Timothy is the one who was then claimed in 1 Corinthians 4, chapter 4, that he is the trustworthy co-worker, and who we then discover as the one to whom Paul writes. So I think we have to look at the collection of the 14 letters in conjunction with Acts. And don't forget, it's not just Acts. Acts is always combined with the so-called Catholic letters, all of which appear in parallels also in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. He quotes from 1 Peter, as I said, more than 30 times. He quotes 8 times, or there's parallels, I have to say, not quote. There are parallels to 2 Peter. There are parallels, as I said, to 1st and 2nd and 3rd John. There's even parallels to the letter to Jude, or by Jude. And of course, there are a few parallels to James. So we have the Catholic letters in the background, and I think they have been redacted and brought together for this collection of 27 letters, or 27 books in our canonical New Testament. And they all are interplaying with each other and creating this imagery, which appears to be convincing and has been convincing, until you start detecting where the bridges are, which are not really working. So let me also disagree with you in one point, and then we might wrap up. I think with Paul's letter collection, the earliest stage, as I said, is Marcion's New Testament. I think we can go one step further back, because when I did the reconstruction of that letter collection of these 10 letters, I noticed a similar slip as we have it in canonical Luke. In canonical Luke, Jesus says in Nazareth, right in the beginning, "Oh, you should have noticed what I've done in Capharnaum." But in canonical Luke, Capharnaum comes a chapter later. People couldn't have known in Nazareth what he did in Capharnaum, because he wasn't yet in Capharnaum. Now people say, well, that is a redactional slip. Somebody has fiddled around with the order of these chapters. And indeed, Tertullian tells us that in Marcion's gospel, the order was correct. First, Jesus goes to Capharnaum, then he goes to Nazareth. And when he says in Nazareth, "You should have noticed what I've done in Capharnaum," it is following the order of the text. Now, in Marcion's text, he was not better than his colleague Luke, because he also has slips. And in Galatians, he says, in Galatians 5:21, he says, "The flesh does not inherit the kingdom of heaven." And before he says, "As I have said before." But Galatians is the first letter. So he couldn't have said it before, and he didn't. But it is a quote which you find one letter later in his order in 1 Corinthians. So same slip, which also means that Marcion is not working from individual letters. He is working on the basis of a collection. And in this collection, 1 Corinthians was standing before Galatians. That's why the back reference then could work. And this tells me, again, the proximity between the different milieus. He might have used a collection which had the same order as the canonical Paul 7 letters are today. So he might have made use of a canonically derived, so from canonical people like Polycarp or others. He might have derived his collection from there. They seem to be of a different textual nature. So I don't think he has cut down these texts. Impossible, I think. But it is rather likely that he reordered the texts and maybe did also some textual revisions, just as Polycarp does his revisions to the texts that he receives. So I think we can go further back and say, well, there might be a collect, or at least one, but probably even two collections, because the three deuteropolines stand together in his collection. So he seems to have made use of two collections, earlier collections of Paul, one, the 3 letters, and then the 7 letters. And I think Kampenhausen is also correct by saying Polycarp's school is a deuteropoline school, as he says, because there are more deuteropoline parallels in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians than there are to the 7 letters. And that's why the first quote where he says, Eidotis hoti, you should know that, he quotes a text from Ephesians and not from the 7 letters. And the second quote, as I said, he quotes from 1 Timothy, from the pseudopolines. So we could say that the milieu where Marcion may have got the 3 letters, the deuteropolines, is from a school like the school, or it is the school of Polycarp. But then the 7 letters that he got, he did get in an order that the canonicals restore, but it is a school or an environment for which we have no idea yet. And I think that is future work, whether that extends into the 1st century, whether that leads back to a letter writer Paul and to a historical Paul, I would love to know that.
Let me take this last super chat and then we'll close. Daniel Bradford, thank you for your super chat. Peter, James, and Galatians, is this trying to be a historical note or shows the letter responds to the gospel rather than predates it?
Yeah, if we knew. I mean, what it certainly is that Galatians, both, I say, in Marcion's version and in the canonical text, have this dispute between James, Peter, John on the one side and Paul on the other side. Now, if that was just a literary device by increasing the authority of Paul, not by any human being, not through any human being, as Galatians start, and extending that into a rough riot with Peter, James, and John, I don't know, it could be. But it explains, whether that's historical or not, but it explains that kind of an exposition that the canonical redactors have on the one side maintained that kind of a rift and also watered it down a bit. Already in canonical Galatians, the debate between Peter, James, John on the one side and Paul on the other side is less tough and rough than what we read in Marcion's Paul. Galatians in Marcion's Paul is even sharper. And it takes place in Jerusalem. So the row between the 4 is not taking part in Antioch, but it's an inner Jerusalem debate. So the canonical redactors remove it already. And when you then take Acts, you can see that we have a tough debate between these 4 in Marcion. We have a less sharp debate in canonical Galatians and an even softer dealing. So they come to an agreement, they make a deal, a good Trumpian result, yeah. They agree on something, and then later Paul in his letter says, I have not agreed to anything. So it's a bit like Trump, turning around. No, it wasn't a deal. Was it a deal? Maybe it was a deal. I tell you what it was tomorrow. So this is a kind of smoothing, is a politicizing, yeah, in Acts that we see, and that starts in canonical Galatians.
You know,
I would trust Acts as much as I trust Trump.
Well, what is also fascinating is that in the Epistles, I don't think we have James identified as the brother of Jesus at all. And so it could be that in canonical Galatians, we are getting someone using Josephus to dissemble us about the timing of all of this, and Acts being a further driving of that home.
Also, if you look at the Greek of Galatians 1:19, it's very, very identical to how Josephus wrote the James passage, which is pretty interesting.
So
Again, I think anything which we have from Josephus, I think we have to touch with great caution.
So it could be the Galatians and Acts are simply misleading us as to who that James was that Paul is having this argument with.
Including Jude.
I think so.
Look, even the letter of James doesn't say it, yeah?
Yeah.
If we didn't have Jude, and that's why Jude is so important, yeah? Because Jude refers then back to James. And so slowly, as I say, the whole thing works only in the canonical New Testament with 27 writings. Take away, and you discover, and you can see the plot is like a good novel. The plot is a plot of the entire collection.
God, it's always an IQ-raising experience to talk to you, Professor Vinzent.
Thank you
very much for this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks also for all the questions and for the contributions.
I agree, James. And that being said, Marcus and James, thank you both for joining me today. And of course, if any of you want to see more of Marcus Vinzent, I tagged the Patristica YouTube channel in the description below. He appears on there frequently. So you want to subscribe to Jack Bull's channel, Patristica, you can do that. The tag is in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment. I'll also have the links to Marcus Vincent's books in the description below as well. If you want to go get any of them, you can do that.
Thank you so much.
All right, everybody. That's it. Thank you both again.
Thanks.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.